This video is going to be a challenge to concordance on the topic of the so-called negative effects of cannabis. I am also going to be making a similar response to concordance regarding his video on water fluoridation. In both videos, I notice a trend where concordance is relaying conclusions based on studies or his own interpretation of studies, but never fully going into the data in a comprehensive way. And what I found when I did that with the studies he's referencing is that we find that the conclusions he's issuing are actually not supported by the studies that he himself is using to justify them. To start with, on the topic of dependence.
The active ingredient, THC, causes physical and psychological dependence in a percentage of users, estimated to be between 7 and 10% in some studies.
Well, this also happens to be the case for, let's say that a human being, were isolated from sunlight for some time, and therefore were unable to produce vitamin D. They would need to be given vitamin D supplementation, or what you would note is they would have a withdrawal symptoms from vitamin D itself. Depression, sleep problems, so on and so forth. The list will go on. But you wouldn't therefore claim that vitamin D is a negative substance or has a negative effect on the health of the individual. All this implies is that the presence of vitamin D in the body allows the person to live at a more optimal state. So there's a possibility that cannabis users are operating at a relatively optimal state. This doesn't mean that they should be using it in every situation that they're in, perhaps, but it challenges the claim that it's a negative mark on cannabis to have it exhibit some symptoms of dependence or withdrawal. What is seemingly more so intuitive to me is that the use of cannabis helps some people deal with the environment that we're living in. And when it's taken away from them, it forces them back into a state where they have to deal with all these things in a scattered way. In my own experience, the use of cannabis has provided a sort of palliative to the sprawling nature of dealing with the economy and things like that in the modern day, in modern America especially. So, yes, it might not be a great thing that people experience irritability or appetite changes or anxiousness when they're off of cannabis. It possibly might be demonstrative of the beneficial, healthful aspect of using it, as opposed to being a negative thing that we should associate with other drugs of withdrawal that we know to kill people, like alcohol, cigarettes, heroin, and the like. In the absence of demonstrating that cannabis causes negative health effects or death, I think you'll find that it makes more sense to put it in the category with things like vitamins. I'm open to discussion on this point, but that's my position, and I think it's worth consideration.
Myth number 2. Smoking marijuana is safer than cigarettes. Not according to a New Zealand study that found that after careful removal of confounders, marijuana increased lung cancer risk by 7% per joint year, compared to 6% per cigarette year in young adults.
Before we look at the 2008 New Zealand study that Concordance mentions here, I'm going to bring up a comprehensive review of 19 separate studies that was published by the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2006. If we scroll down to the results here, marijuana smoking and lung cancer. These studies were not able to demonstrate a relationship between marijuana smoking and a diagnosis of lung cancer. One of these studies was a cohort study with 64,855 people. Okay, the only study in here, in this paragraph that's described, that potentially shows a link, finds that in this case-controlled study, the odds of lung cancer in users of hashish or keef to be 1.93. However, the relative risk of the control group is 1. So this means that it's approximately, apologize for the sirens in the background, but this number means it's approximately 2 times more likely than the control group for marijuana users, specifically of hashish or keef, to be getting lung cancer. But if we look at a 95% confidence interval, which is the interval that the experimenters can be 95% confident that their value falls within, on the low end, it's 0.57. So on the low end of their confidence interval, cannabis could be exhibiting a protective effect in cutting the number of lung cancers in half. How can we take this result seriously if that's the case? The answer is we can't. We need to look at studies that use a larger sample size and keep doing them to find the valid result, because being able to find a protective and simultaneously carcinogenic effect in one study, it sort of doesn't make sense, right? So, overall, given the rest of the studies, none of them demonstrated an effect in this review. None of the 19 studies, okay? So if we go to look at one study that was done after that, this 2008 New Zealand study, let's take a look how many people were in this. There were 79 cases of lung cancer. 79. We've got one study that's a review of 19 studies, and within that review, there's one study in particular that had 65,000 subjects, and this whole review failed to find a link. Now we've got this other study coming out 2 years later with 79 people only. Okay? The risk that they apparently established for the highest use group of cannabis was 5.7, approximately 6 times more likely to get cancer than the control group. However, within this confidence interval, the low value is 1.5. So if there's only 1.5 chance of getting it on the low end of things, it's another reason why this is questionable. Plus, look how big the range is, 1.5 to 21.6. A simple rule here is the wider this range, the wider this confidence interval, the less sound the conclusions can be made from it. Okay? And since it's only 79 people, it kind of makes you wonder why Concordance would want to focus on this study and not the review. If we look at another study that was done in 2006, a couple of years after, or in the same year, this was actually included in that retrospective review. We have a study with 1,212 cancer cases and 1,040 cancer-free controls. This study, done by Donald Tashkin and his colleagues at UCLA, found 0 link between cannabis and the causing of lung cancer. In fact, if we look at these values, for laryngeal cancer, lung cancer, pharyngeal cancer, esophageal cancer, all of these values are falling below 1, which, although not statistically significant, may suggest a protective effect. And this is a study with 1,200 cancer cases. So, again, we have this review, we have a study with 64,000, we have a study with 1,200. All of these studies demonstrating no or a very slight possibility of protective effect. Whereas the one study that is presented to us by Concordance has a whopping 79 people and a very low quality result. Now, to top all of that off, there actually is plenty of studies coming out these days, and from the past as early as 1974, that demonstrate cannabis actually demonstrates anti-carcinogenic effects. This effect appears to be noticed in multiple types of cancer: breast cancer, brain cancer, lung cancer in a Harvard study, and this just adds weight to the conclusion that we need to be more deliberate and responsible regarding cannabis, which is not what's being done here. I don't have time to go into all the studies that show cannabis as an anti-cancer agent, but suffice it to say that they're out there, and that if you look, you'll find them. And oftentimes they will be studies that are manipulating variables in real time, as opposed to the trend that we're noticing with the studies that Concordance is referring to, which are just looking at past and survey data.
It contains up to twice the concentration of the carcinogenic polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or PACs. Smokers don't use filters, hold the smoke in their lungs longer, and inhale more deeply. They also absorb 5 times as much carbon monoxide from each puff of a joint versus the same puff of cigarette.
Okay, well, let's say that does happen. It's neither here nor there, and in fact, this reality prompts us to make other potential speculations. For instance, since there's so much more tar, apparently, and we notice no cancer resulting from it, this may be implying that the active components of the plant itself are anti-cancer, or preventing the negative effects that tar may cause, particularly lung cancer. Now, in terms of pulmonary structure, function, and symptoms, again, we have Concordance referring us to a New Zealand study which utilizes a limited number of subjects. So before I go into the specifics of this study that he lists here, I'm going to first go into a study that actually is a comprehensive review of many more subjects to see if we can compare the two. Okay, so in order to do this, I pulled up a study from the Journal of American Medical Association from January 11th, 2012. Association between marijuana exposure and pulmonary function over 20 years. Okay, so this study came out after Concordance's video, which I believe makes it even more appropriate that we go into it now. Now, what are the results of this study? Conclusion: occasional and low cumulative marijuana use was not associated with adverse effects on pulmonary function. Okay? In fact, if we look at the results description here, with heavy marijuana use, the net association with FEV1, which is the amount of air expelled in 1 second, was not significantly different from the baseline. And the net association with FVC remained significantly greater than baseline at 20 joint years, 76 milliliters. What does this mean? Well, there was no significant effect on the forced expiratory volume, and the total amount that was able to be expelled from the lungs, the FVC, was actually increased at all levels of marijuana use. So the capacity of the lungs is actually being increased in this 20-year study with 5,115 men and women in 4 U.S. cities. The result is no problems or adverse effects on pulmonary function, and in fact, an increased lung capacity. Okay, interesting. Okay, so if we look at that in juxtaposition with the study that Concordance directs us to from 2007, we have 339 subjects. Okay, so right away we're dealing with 339 versus 5,000 subjects. So I believe that it's safe to say in this case that we can update our understanding of this phenomenon. If we have a 20-year study with 5,000 subjects demonstrating no negative effect on pulmonary function, and in fact an increased lung capacity, significantly increased over time from marijuana use, there's no reason to continue to use this New Zealand study as our baseline for information. And in fact, if you read the study, it shows also that increased lung capacity effect that we noticed in the later study that I just showed you. So both of these studies demonstrate increased lung capacity. I have no clue where the experimenters get this number, 2.5 to 5 tobacco cigarettes. I would love for Concordance or anyone else to explain how they get that number, because the effects on lung function were close to nil. So, what, did they just pull this number out of their ass? It does kind of seem like that. Also, we have this measure of cannabis smoking was associated with decreased lung density on HRCT scans. Okay, decreased lung density. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Who knows? Just saying that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. If the lung density is decreasing, perhaps the efficiency of the lung structures that remain are going up. Maybe it's evolution of the lungs in real time. We don't know. All I can say for sure is that the largest study of its kind has demonstrated no negative effect on lung function and increased lung capacity. Okay, this whole thing about it's not possible to overdose smoking marijuana. Okay? You would have to smoke 1,000 joints, according to this chart. 1,000 joints. To continue to assert that that is possible means that you have a disconnect between imaginative possibility and literal possibility. Right? You can imagine someone sitting there smoking 1,000 joints, but that's not a real person. The only thing I could say is if there's a highly concentrated, potent form of it that comes about in the future that is equivalent to 1,000 joints and it just hits the system like crazy, that maybe, I don't know, maybe that would kill somebody. Let's be careful about stuff like that if we choose to do that, right? But right now, it's sort of an absurd point to be making. It's just a distraction.
It is a known carcinogen, or cancer-causing substance, and a teratogen that causes birth defects in pregnant mothers.
Okay. So we have him making a whole bunch of claims. It's a known carcinogen. No, it's not. We don't have it demonstrating that it's carcinogenic, so that's just false. Okay, so if we look at this study right here, marijuana usage, the association of marijuana use with outcome of pregnancy. Within the 95% confidence interval here, there is a possibility that marijuana lowers the possibility of birth defects. Do you see this? 0.97. That's less than 1. Therefore, that could mean that. The fact that you settle upon 1.36 is completely arbitrary. If this is attempted to be denied, you're lying. Okay, so how can we take this to be a serious result? In fact, given the well-known adverse effects of alcohol consumption during pregnancy, it produces a questionable result here in that it shows a lower chance of birth defects with alcohol and actually places being white as being more of a possibility, being more of a risk factor for birth defects than using alcohol during pregnancy. So that alone, like just the multiplicity of factors to analyze there, produces an ultimate state where it's questionable that we are going to conclude that marijuana has that effect. And then for low birth weight, we don't even see any effect. In fact, again, the 95% confidence interval dips below 1 again. This is not sound. That's not a sound analysis. So if we want to further kind of break down this issue, we can look at this review, which was done in 1991. The study that we were just looking at was from '83. This study, prenatal marijuana use, epidemiology, methodologic issues, and infant outcome, demonstrates no contradictory and no significant results in relation to marijuana as a teratogen.
There's new research that it's a significant risk factor in the development of psychoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Really?
The active ingredient marijuana causes changes to your brain that predispose you to psychoses and mood disorders later in life.
Okay, this is flat out a position that Concordance is taking, but not with any basis. There's no justification for assuming that the correlation between schizophrenia and cannabis use is one that is directional, such that using it makes you susceptible. In fact, if we look at certain studies on this topic, we find that a comprehensive review of the literature from 2009 concludes there's no firm evidence that cannabis causes schizophrenia spectrum disorders. The evidence for that argument that schizophrenic patients are attracted to cannabis is also not strong. The most plausible explanation is that cannabis use and psychosis proneness may have synergistic effects in a vulnerable minority. Okay, we can see that recreational doses of THC produce significant dopamine release in the human striatum, since schizophrenia is a dopaminergic, known to be following a dopaminergic pathway, so that what we find is that drugs that interfere with dopamine in the brain tend to be ones that are used to treat schizophrenia. The conclusion is that in the largest study of its kind so far, we have shown that recreational cannabis users do not release significant amounts of dopamine from an oral THC dose equivalent to a standard cannabis cigarette.
One effect I didn't discuss was learning impairment. If you are a student and you value your education, smoking pot can reduce your ability to create long-term memory connections. Cannabis doesn't make you dumb, but it keeps you from getting full use of your education.
Okay. This is sort of the cherry on top of things. Now, Concordance posts this chart while talking about cannabis reducing learning capacity. So one would assume that this study that he's referring to would demonstrate this effect, right? Well, even if you just look at the chart, you can see that the cannabis group performed consistently better on all measures. Okay. So what if we look at the study itself? We bring that up. Cannabis use and cognition in schizophrenia. Of the 23 studies that were found, this is a review of studies, 14 reported that the cannabis users had better cognitive performance than the schizophrenia non-users. 8 studies reported no or minimal difference, and only 1 study reported better cognitive performance in the schizophrenia non-user group. Our own results confirm the overall impression of better cognitive performance in the cannabis user group. So, Concordance's purported message here at the end is to not use cannabis because it can affect learning negatively. And he puts up this study for schizophrenic patients. And the actual result is that it seems to improve cognitive ability, especially in these patients. Concordance, what are you doing? It's time to seriously start questioning the way you approach these topics. Because what I see you doing is taking a societally accepted norm, which is, in this case, to denigrate cannabis, and then selectively finding ways to promote that idea. But the data is so bad that you're not even able to filter out the fact that in your own video that you're posting things that show its benefit. The same goes for fluoride. You accept the accepted status quo of fluoride, and then you go from there without even noticing that one of the studies that you focus on shows no statistically significant effect. But I'm going to get into that eventually. Now, I know that this isn't the most entertaining video or well-organized video, but I tried to touch on the most salient points, and I hope that it's clear to you who are watching that Concordance right now, whether or not he's intentionally doing this, cannot be trusted to be relaying sound information, to be relaying true scientific conclusions. I would encourage everyone to research cannabis and cancer and learn all of the types of cancer and diseases that can be prevented and treated with cannabis if we simply wake up to what it really is. In order to do that, we need to move beyond videos like this one that I'm responding to and find the power in ourselves to look into the research and see what's really going on. Godspeed.